somewhere in the vast tobacco belt of eastern Virginia, the courthouse ledgers of the 1,792nd contain birth records that, by every legal and social standard of the time, should never have existed. 37 children, each listed as white, each carrying the surnames of influential planter families, each tied to the same biological father, a man who, according to the law, was himself considered property. Those fragile documents survived 2 courthouse fires, a flood, and at least 3 separate attempts to have them sealed under emergency judicial orders. When local historians stumbled upon them in 1889, they barely had time to examine their contents before the records abruptly disappeared from public view. What those pages revealed about power, silence, and the machinery behind an arrangement no one dared speak of would challenge the very foundation of how we think about that period. And before we continue with the story of the man identified only as number 47, I want to know something. If you're watching from Virginia or anywhere across the South, drop your state in the comments. What comes next may permanently change the way you see your own local history. Now, let me take you back to where this impossible situation began. The Rappahannock River region in 1774 was a landscape of contradictions. Along the water's edge, grand plantation houses rose like white monuments to prosperity, their columns visible for miles across fields where tobacco grew in endless geometric rows. The population of the county numbered nearly 8,000 souls, though only 2,000 of those were considered fully human under the law. This was a place where wealth was measured in acres and in people, where the distance between the great house and the quarters could be crossed in 5 minutes, but represented an unbridgeable chasm in every other sense. The Warfield Plantation occupied 1,200 acres of prime bottomland, its main house, a 3-story Georgian masterpiece that had taken 7 years to complete. Marcus Warfield had inherited the property from his father in 1769, along with 93 enslaved workers and debts that would take a decade to clear. He was 31 years old, educated at William and Mary, ambitious in the way that second sons often are when they unexpectedly inherit everything. His wife Catherine came from a declining Charleston family with an impressive name and little else. Their marriage had produced 1 daughter in 5 years, a fact that generated quiet speculation in the drawing rooms of neighboring estates. The county's social structure was as rigid as its architecture. At the top sat perhaps 20 families who owned the majority of the land. Below them, a scattering of smaller farmers, artisans, and merchants who aspired to join the planter class. And below that, the vast majority people who existed in ledgers as assets, their lives circumscribed by laws designed to prevent precisely what would unfold at the Warfield estate over the next 2 decades. In 1774, Marcus Warfield made a purchase that neighbors would remember as unusual even at the time. At the Richmond market, he paid premium price for a young man of about 20 years, tall, uncommonly well-proportioned, with features that suggested mixed ancestry several generations back. The bill of sale listed him only as male, healthy, field suitable, but Warfield had him assigned to the house staff immediately, an appointment that raised eyebrows among the overseers who knew the rigid hierarchies of plantation labor. The household staff at that time consisted of 12 people, cooks, maids, valet, a coachman, a nurse for the child. They lived in quarters behind the main house, close enough to be summoned at any hour, but separate enough to maintain the fiction of distance. The new arrival, given the work name Joseph by the house steward, was assigned to assist with heavy labor, moving furniture, maintaining the grounds, tasks that kept him visible around the main house throughout the day. Catherine Warfield was 26 that summer, a woman whose portrait from the period shows delicate features and an expression of studied composure. Letters she wrote to her sister in Charleston reveal an educated woman fluent in French, well read in contemporary literature, and deeply conscious of her position. She managed the household with efficiency, maintained correspondence with relatives, and presided over the small social gatherings that the plantation hosted. Her marriage was, by the standards of the time, unremarkable, cordial, appropriate, and emotionally distant in the way that was expected of such arrangements. What happened next unfolded so gradually that no single moment marked the beginning. There were errands that required Joseph's presence in the main house, conversations that Catherine initiated about household matters, moments when Marcus was away on business in Richmond or Williamsburg for days at a time. The household staff later testified to nothing unusual, only that Mrs. Warfield had taken to giving Joseph his instructions personally rather than through the house steward, and that certain tasks seemed to require his attention specifically. The first pregnancy was announced in the spring of 1775 as tensions with Britain escalated into open conflict. Marcus Warfield expressed pleasure at the prospect of a son. The child born in December of that year was a healthy boy with fair skin and dark eyes. They named him Marcus Jr. Nothing in the birth was remarkable. Nothing in the county registry suggested anything other than a legitimate heir to the Warfield estate. But in the quarters, whispers had already begun. The timing of Catherine's seclusion, the resemblance some claimed to see in the infant's features, the particular attention she paid to Joseph's comfort and positioning in the household. These were dangerous observations to voice, the kind that could result in a whipping or sale if they reached the wrong ears. So they remained whispers passed only among those whose lives depended on reading the invisible currents of power in the great house. The second pregnancy followed 18 months later, another son, then a third. By 1780, Catherine Warfield had given birth to 5 children, all documented as legitimate heirs of Marcus Warfield, all suspiciously robust in a time when infant mortality among the planter class often reached 30%. Marcus himself seemed pleased with his expanding family, his public reputation enhanced by his apparent virility, and the promise of multiple sons to inherit portions of the estate. But the neighboring estates were beginning to notice patterns. The Bradfords, whose property had joined the Warfields' eastern border, remarked on the frequency of Catherine's pregnancies. The Sutton, whose matriarch had known Catherine since childhood, noted in letters that the Warfield children seemed uncommonly healthy, as if blessed by some vigor not typical of our families. These observations were made carefully without direct accusation, but the subtext was clear to those who understood the coded language of plantation society. The truth began to crystallize in 1783 when something unprecedented occurred at a neighboring plantation. Rebecca Bradford, wife of Thomas Bradford and cousin to Catherine Warfield, announced that she too was expecting a child. This was surprising. The Bradfords had been married for 11 years without producing offspring, and Rebecca was approaching 40. But what shocked the local community came after the birth, when Rebecca's personal maid mentioned to another enslaved woman that Mrs. Bradford had requested that Joseph from the Warfield estate be loaned to help with heavy work during the late stages of her pregnancy, when Mr. Bradford was frequently away with the militia. The Bradford child was born in April 1784. Those who saw the infant remarked on its unusual vigor, its strong constitution, and some, in very private settings, noted certain similarities to the Warfield children, the set of the eyes, the shape of the hands, the particular tone of the skin that suggested some heritage beyond the expected lineages. This might have remained one more hidden reality in a world full of them, except that it happened again. Sarah Sutton, aged 32 and married to the county's largest landowner after Marcus Warfield, failed to conceive for the first 7 years of her marriage. Then in 1785, she too requested that Joseph assist with estate work while her husband traveled to Philadelphia on business. 9 months later, she delivered twins. A pattern was emerging, but it was a pattern that could not be spoken aloud. To acknowledge it would be to acknowledge something that threatened the entire structure of inheritance, legitimacy, and racial hierarchy upon which the planter class depended. These children were being born into white families, documented as legitimate heirs with no legal or social mechanism to challenge their parentage. The law was clear. Children inherited the status of their mother. If the mother was white and married, the child was white and legitimate, regardless of biological paternity. What made the situation even more complex was that Marcus Warfield seemed not only aware of the arrangement, but actively facilitating it. Joseph remained on the Warfield estate, never sold or reassigned, always available when certain wives in the county requested his presence for heavy labor at their estates. There was a schedule almost methodical in its implementation. A request would come, Marcus would grant permission, Joseph would spend weeks or months working at a neighboring plantation, and within a year, a child would be born. By 1790, the count had reached 23 children across 7 different planter families, all documented as white, all legally the sons and daughters of prominent men who commanded respect and wielded power in county affairs. The birth registry maintained by the county clerk showed nothing unusual, just a prosperous region experiencing a baby boom among its leading families. But the enslaved community knew. They kept their own records passed down orally, marking the births and noting the pattern. They watched as Joseph moved through the county, always accompanied by appropriate documentation, always returned to the Warfield estate, always maintained in a position of relative comfort, unusual for someone of his status. They understood what was happening, even if they could never speak of it openly. A conspiracy of silence was being maintained by both the powerful and the powerless, though for very different reasons. The tension inherent in this arrangement finally manifested in 1791, when a visiting merchant from Pennsylvania witnessed Joseph accompanying Catherine Warfield on a trip to Richmond. The merchant, unfamiliar with Virginia's complex racial and social codes, made the mistake of commenting to Marcus Warfield that he had a very attentive servant who seems uncommonly familiar with your wife's preferences. The statement was innocent, but its implications were dangerous. Marcus Warfield's response was carefully calibrated. He explained with patience that suggested he had made this explanation before, that Joseph was a trusted member of the household, that his loyalty was absolute, and that certain arrangements in Virginia may seem peculiar to those unfamiliar with our particular circumstances. The merchant left with the distinct impression that he had stumbled onto something he was not meant to question. As the 1,790 seconds progressed, the situation evolved into something even more elaborate. The children were growing up, and several of them bore unmistakable similarities to one another, despite being raised in different households with different surnames. At social gatherings where the planter families assembled, observers might have noticed a particular cast to certain faces, a consistent set of features appearing across supposedly unrelated family lines. The Warfield children remained the most numerous. Catherine had given birth to 11 children by 1795, all documented as fathered by Marcus. But the Bradford family now claimed 4 children. The Sutton had 6, and 3 other families in the county had each added 2 or 3 to their respective lineages. The mathematics were remarkable. 37 children born to 7 different white women over a 20-year period, all thriving, all absorbing education and inheritance rights as their mother's legitimate offspring. Joseph himself had aged into his 42nds, still maintained at the Warfield estate in a position that defied the usual trajectory of enslaved labor. He was not worked in the fields. He was not hired out for cash income, as was common with skilled workers. He was kept available, well-fed, housed in quarters better than those provided to the overseers, and he remained silent. There is no record of him ever speaking about the situation to anyone, even to others in the enslaved community. What drove this arrangement? The question haunted those who observed it from a safe distance. Some theories suggested that Marcus Warfield had been rendered infertile by a childhood illness, and that rather than face the social death of being unable to produce heirs, he had engineered this solution. Others proposed that it was Catherine who wielded the true power, that she had somehow leveraged knowledge or leverage over her husband to force his complicity. Still others imagined a more mercenary explanation, that Marcus was being paid by the other planters to maintain Joseph's availability, turning his wife's fertility and Joseph's genetics into a profitable enterprise. The truth, insofar as it can be determined from fragmentary records, appears to be some combination of all these factors. Marcus Warfield's medical history revealed in letters to a physician in Charleston confirms that he suffered a severe fever at age 17 that left him with diminished capacities in certain respects. Catherine's letters to her sister suggest a woman who understood her position and wielded what power she had with calculation. I have secured certain arrangements that ensure my comfort and Marcus's continued position in society. It is not love, but it is sustainable. And Joseph existed at the center of this arrangement as both crucial participant and complete non-entity in legal terms. He had no rights, no voice, no ability to refuse or negotiate. Yet he was treated with a care that recognized his unique value. When a traveling slave trader offered Marcus an enormous sum for Joseph in 1794, Marcus refused without hesitation. Joseph was not for sale. He was too valuable as he was. The conspiracy extended beyond just the immediate families. The county physician who attended all the births knew. The midwives who assisted knew. The house slaves who witnessed the comings and goings knew. The overseers who documented Joseph's movements knew, and they all maintained silence, bound by either complicity, fear, or the understanding that to speak would be to unravel the social fabric they all depended upon. But silence has a weight to it, and as the children grew into adolescence, that weight became harder to bear. In 1798, the eldest Warfield son, Marcus Jr., now 23, announced his engagement to a young woman from a prominent Fredericksburg family. The marriage would unite two fortunes, secure valuable political connections, and produce the next generation of the Warfield line. But those who looked closely at Marcus Jr. might have noticed something in his features, something that would continue into his own children, a shadow of inheritance that legal documents could never fully erase. The full scope of the arrangement might never have been documented if not for a convergence of circumstances in 1799. The Warfield plantation was experiencing financial difficulties. Tobacco prices had collapsed, and Marcus's expansion plans had left the estate heavily mortgaged. He began the painful process of liquidating assets, which in the Virginia of that era meant selling people. The sale notices went up in Richmond and Williamsburg. The Warfield estate would be selling 30 enslaved workers to settle debts. The list was posted publicly as required by law with each person's name, approximate age, and skills. Joseph's name appeared on the list described as male, 45 years, house service, excellent health. The announcement created panic among the other planter families. If Joseph were sold to someone outside the county, the arrangement would be broken. Worse, if he were sold to someone who understood his unique situation, he might become a source of blackmail or exposure. Within a week of the notice being posted, Marcus Warfield received visits from Thomas Bradford, Edmund Sutton, and representatives from 3 other families. What they discussed was never recorded in writing, but the outcome was documented. Joseph's name was removed from the sale list. In its place, a complicated financial arrangement was structured whereby the participating families would provide loans to the Warfield estate at favorable terms secured against future tobacco crops. Marcus would retain ownership of Joseph. The arrangement would continue, but something had shifted. The near catastrophe had forced everyone involved to confront the fragility of their conspiracy. A single financial crisis had nearly exposed everything. What if Marcus died unexpectedly? What if one of the wives, in a moment of guilt or anger, decided to confess to a minister? What if Joseph himself, after years of silent cooperation, decided to speak? It was Catherine who apparently proposed the solution. In late 1799, she suggested that Joseph be formally manumitted, granted freedom, but with conditions attached. He would be freed legally, removing the possibility of his being sold, but he would remain on the Warfield estate as a paid servant, bound by a contract that ensured his continued availability and silence. The other families agreed to contribute to his annual salary. Joseph himself was presented with this arrangement as a fait accompli, whether he desired it or not, because his freedom served everyone's interests better than his continued enslavement. The manumission papers were filed in January 1800. They described Joseph as a faithful servant granted freedom in recognition of long service and specified that he would remain employed at the Warfield estate for a salary of $60 per year, a sum that was simultaneously generous for a freed black man and insulting for the value he represented. The papers required his signature, or rather his mark, as he had never been taught to write. He made an X on the document that transformed his legal status while changing almost nothing about his daily reality. What did Joseph think of all this? The historical record offers only silence. He left no letters, no testimony, no recorded words. We know he accepted the arrangement because he remained at the Warfield estate. We know he continued to father children with the planter wives because the births continued, 5 more between 1,800 and 1,804, bringing the total to 42, with 37 surviving past infancy. The children themselves were living paradoxes. They grew up as white Virginians, educated, propertied, completely integrated into planter society. Several of the sons attended the College of William and Mary. The daughters made advantageous marriages into other prominent families. They inherited enslaved people, owned land, participated in the political and social life of the gentry class. Their biological paternity was simultaneously the most important fact about them and something that could never be acknowledged. In 1803, an incident occurred that revealed the psychological toll of this sustained deception. Elizabeth Warfield, Catherine's 4th daughter and then age 17, apparently discovered the truth about her parentage through overheard conversations among the house staff. She confronted her mother in a scene that several people in the house reported hearing, but none would describe in detail. The confrontation ended with Elizabeth being sent to live with Catherine's relatives in Charleston, where she remained for 2 years. When she returned, she never spoke of the matter again, and she married within a year to a man from a Williamsburg merchant family, leaving Virginia permanently. The incident highlighted a troubling question. What would happen when these children, now adults, began having their own children? Would the genetics manifest in ways that could not be explained away? The planter families were beginning to realize that they had not just hidden a scandal. They had introduced a permanent alteration into their bloodlines that would echo through generations. The year 1806 brought a crisis no one had anticipated. Gabriel's rebellion in 1800 and the subsequent tightening of laws governing free black people in Virginia created an increasingly hostile environment for someone in Joseph's position. New legislation required free black people to leave the state within a year of manumission unless they received special dispensation from the county court. Joseph, freed in 1800, should have left by 1801. He had not, and technically, he was now illegally present in Virginia. The county sheriff, a man named Howell, who had assumed his position in 1805 and was not part of the original conspiracy, began asking questions about Joseph's status. Why was he still in the county? By what authority did he remain? The questions were innocent administrative inquiries, but they threatened to pull apart the carefully constructed fiction. Marcus Warfield, now 68 and in declining health, was forced to appear before the county court to petition for Joseph to be allowed to remain. The petition had to provide justification for why this particular freed black man was so valuable that the law should be bent to accommodate him. The petition, which survives in county records, describes Joseph as a person of exceptional character, who has performed services to several families in this county of such a nature that his departure would cause considerable hardship. The vagueness of the language is striking. What services? Which families? The petition was signed not only by Marcus Warfield, but by Thomas Bradford, Edmund Sutton, and 4 other family heads. An unusual show of unified support for a freed black man in a time of increasing racial paranoia. The court approved the petition without recorded objection, but the proceedings had drawn attention. People were talking about why so many prominent men cared so much about one freed servant. It was Catherine, now 58, who took decisive action. In a move that demonstrated both her intelligence and her understanding of social dynamics, she arranged for Joseph to be publicly baptized and received into the Anglican Church. The ceremony was performed by the county's most respected minister and attended by members of all the families involved. The message was clear. Joseph was a Christian, a person of moral standing, someone who belonged in the community. The baptism served as a social inoculation against suspicion, but the underlying tension could not be resolved so easily. As more people began to notice the unusual arrangement, as the children grew and had children of their own, the secret became harder to keep. Small inconsistencies accumulated. A traveling portraitist painting family pictures in 1808 remarked privately to his assistant about the curious similarity of features in the younger generation across different families. A new physician setting up practice in the county in 1809 noted in his private journal that several of the families seemed to show evidence of mixed heritage in the children, despite the apparent purity of both parents' lineages. These observations were never made public, but they circulated in the whispered conversations of those who were beginning to piece together the truth. The conspiracy was becoming an open secret, something everyone knew, but no one could acknowledge without destroying the social order. In 1810, a crisis erupted that nearly ended everything. One of the Bradford sons, aged 26 and recently returned from 3 years studying in Philadelphia, announced at a family dinner that he had become an abolitionist. He declared his intention to free the enslaved people he had inherited from his grandfather and to publicly advocate for emancipation. This was dangerous enough, but his father's panicked reaction suggested something more. Thomas Bradford took his son to his study, and what transpired there is unknown, but the son emerged pale and shaking. He left Virginia within a week and never returned, moving to Ohio, where he established himself as a merchant and never mentioned his Virginia family again. What had Thomas Bradford told him? Almost certainly he had revealed the truth about the son's own parentage, that he was not Bradford's biological son, that his claim to the family inheritance rested on a lie, and that to become an outspoken abolitionist would inevitably lead to questions about his own background that would destroy not only his position, but his mother's reputation and the legitimacy of his siblings. The young man's sudden departure and permanent silence suggest the devastating effectiveness of this revelation. The beginning of the end came in 1812, as the United States entered war with Britain and Virginia mobilized its militia. Marcus Warfield died in March of that year, age 74, and his death triggered a series of events that would finally bring the truth into the light. The funeral was held on a cold morning when fog rolled in from the Rappahannock, shrouding the plantation in gray. Every prominent family in the county attended, a show of respect for a man who had been a pillar of their community for over 4 decades. The enslaved workers lined the path to the family cemetery, heads bowed as custom demanded. Joseph stood among them, though his position was ambiguous, technically free, practically bound, legally separate, but functionally essential to the assembled family's carefully maintained fictions. Catherine wept at the graveside, but those who watched closely noted something performative in her grief. She was 74 herself, frail in recent years, and the elaborate deception that had structured her entire adult life was about to collapse under its own weight. Marcus had been the architect of their arrangement, the one who had managed the other family's expectations and maintained the financial structures that kept everyone invested in silence. Without him, the conspiracy lacked a coordinator. The will was read in April in the Warfield House drawing room with all 11 surviving children present. The attorney, a man named Havsham, who had served the family for 20 years, read through the standard provisions with practice efficiency, the plantation and majority of assets to Marcus Jr., smaller bequests to the other sons, dowies for the daughters who remained unmarried, a pension for Catherine, all of it predictable, appropriate to a wealthy planter's estate. Then Havsham reached the codicil, added just 3 months before Marcus's death. His voice faltered slightly as he read, "To the faithful servant Joseph, in recognition of services rendered across many years to this family and to my dear friends who have shared in my fortune, I bequeath the sum of $5,000 to be paid from the estate within 6 months of my death." The room went silent. $5,000 was more than many overseers earned in a lifetime. It was a sum that demanded explanation, and the will provided none beyond that carefully worded phrase, "Services rendered to this family and to my dear friends." Marcus Jr. stood abruptly, his face flushed. At 37, he had built his own reputation as a capable manager, expanding his inherited portion of the estate and establishing himself in county politics. But he was not a fool, and he understood immediately what his father had done. The bequest was both acknowledgment and trap. It confirmed Joseph's importance while making his relationship to the family undeniable in legal records that would survive for generations. "This is inappropriate," Marcus Jr. said, his voice tight. Father must have been in declining mental capacity when he added this provision. The attorney shook his head. "I witnessed the codicil myself, along with Dr. Morrison and Reverend Hughes. Your father was entirely lucid. He insisted on this provision specifically." Catherine spoke from her chair by the window, her voice surprisingly strong. "Your father knew what he was doing. The bequest stands." The tension in that room was suffocating. The children, adults now, with their own families and positions, looked at one another with dawning comprehension. Some had suspected for years. Others were only now beginning to understand. And several, including Marcus Jr., had known the full truth since their late teens, when the burden of maintaining the family's reputation had been passed to them like a hereditary disease. The meeting dissolved without resolution. The children departed to their separate homes, the bequest hanging over all of them like a sword suspended by fraying thread. Within days, the news had spread through the county's social networks. People were talking openly now, speculating about why Marcus Warfield would leave such a fortune to a freed black man. The explanations offered ranged from the mundane. Joseph had saved Marcus's life at some point, to the scandalous whispers that had circulated for years, but never been spoken in polite company. Thomas Bradford, now 71 and in poor health, summoned his sons to a meeting. What he told them has never been recorded directly, but the family's papers include a letter from his eldest son to a brother in Kentucky dated May 1812. "Father has confessed matters regarding our parentage that I cannot commit fully to paper. Suffice to say that the Warfield bequest has exposed secrets that several families have maintained for decades. We are discussing how to manage the situation, but I fear the revelation is inevitable." Edmund Sutton took a different approach. He visited Catherine privately and offered to contest the will, arguing that Marcus had been unduly influenced. Catherine refused. "Let the truth be known," she told him, according to Sutton's diary. "I am too old and too tired to maintain the deception any longer. My children know. Your children know. We have all been living a lie, and I will not spend my remaining days protecting it." Sutton was horrified by her fatalism, but he could not control her. And in truth, Catherine's exhaustion with the conspiracy was understandable. She had spent 40 years managing an impossible situation, coordinating lies, maintaining appearances, ensuring that 7 families remained aligned in their mutual deception. Marcus's death had freed her from the obligation to continue. She was ready to let the structure collapse, whatever the consequences. In June, Catherine made a decision that would accelerate everything. She began sorting through her private papers, preparing to have them archived with the County Historical Society. Among those papers were letters, shockingly explicit letters that documented her side of the arrangement. She had kept them hidden in a locked box that only she could access, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as confession to a future she would never see. One letter in particular, written to her sister in Charleston in 1795, laid out the truth with clinical precision. "Marcus has not been able to perform the duties of a husband since before we married, the result of a fever in his youth that left him incapable. The man Joseph, who lives on our property, has given me 11 children and has provided similar service to Rebecca Bradford, Sarah Sutton, and others whose names I will not commit to paper." Marcus accepts this because his pride depends on being thought capable of fathering heirs. The other families participate because their wives were also unable to conceive with their husbands, or because the husbands themselves were incapable. It is a collective secret sustained by mutual need and enforced by mutual vulnerability. We are all complicit and we are all trapped. Catherine showed this letter to her eldest daughter, Amelia, age 31, and asked her what she thought should be done with it. The question was both genuine inquiry and test. What Amelia decided would reveal whether the next generation would maintain the conspiracy or let it die. Amelia read the letter 3 times, sitting in her mother's parlor while afternoon light slanted through the windows. Her own children were playing in the garden outside. 3 boys and a girl, all documented as the legitimate offspring of her husband, Richard Cavendish, though Amelia had long suspected the truth about her own parentage. The letter confirmed what she had intuited since adolescence. "Mother," Amelia said finally, "if you preserve this letter, it will destroy our family's reputation. Every one of us will be questioned. My brothers will lose their positions. My sisters will be ostracized. My own children will be marked as illegitimate." Catherine nodded. "I know, but I am also tired of the lie. Your father built this arrangement, and it has sustained us all. But it has required constant vigilance and absolute dishonesty. I have lived my entire adult life in fear of discovery. I would like to die having told the truth, then burn the letter and tell me the truth yourself," Amelia suggested. "You do not need to preserve it for posterity." But Catherine shook her head. "If I burn it, the truth dies with me, and the lie continues into your generation and beyond. Someone must know. Someone must preserve the record, even if it cannot be publicly acknowledged." The conversation ended without resolution, but Amelia left with the letter in her possession. For weeks she struggled with what to do. She discussed it with her husband, who was horrified and insisted it be destroyed. She consulted with her brother Marcus Jr., who threatened legal action if she made the letter public. She even, in a moment of desperation, showed it to Reverend Hughes, the county's Anglican minister, seeking spiritual guidance. Hughes's reaction was telling. He did not express shock or moral outrage. Instead, he sighed deeply and said, "I have suspected something of this nature for many years. The patterns were too consistent to be coincidental, but I could never speak of it without proof, and I had no desire to destroy families based on speculation." He advised Amelia to preserve the letter, but to ensure it would not become public in a way that would harm the living. "Let future generations judge," he said. "We are too close to the situation to handle it justly." Catherine died suddenly in September 1812. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but her personal physician noted in his records that she had been taking increasingly large doses of laudanum in the final weeks of her life. Whether her death was suicide or accidental overdose remains ambiguous, but the timing, just as the scandal was reaching critical mass, suggests a woman who chose her exit rather than face the consequences of revelation. Her death brought all the tensions to a head. The sorting of her affections fell to her daughters, and Amelia made a decision that would haunt the family for generations. She took Catherine's letter to the county clerk and demanded that it be entered into the official record as part of Catherine's estate papers. The clerk, a young man named Patterson, who had held the position for less than 2 years, was terrified by the implications. He understood immediately that this letter, if entered into public records, would expose the most prominent families in the county to scandal that could destroy them. But he also understood that refusing to file it would be a dereliction of his legal duty and could cost him his position. Patterson brought the matter to Judge Harrison, the county's senior magistrate, and himself a member of the planter class. Harrison read the letter in his chambers, his face growing progressively paler. He was 63 years old, had presided over the county court for 20 years, and had never encountered a situation with such far-reaching implications. "This cannot be made public," Harrison said finally. "The damage would be catastrophic." "With respect, Your Honor," Patterson replied. "Virginia law requires that all documents submitted as evidence in estate settlements be maintained as public record. I cannot legally refuse to file this letter without a court order sealing it." Harrison considered this, A court order sealing the letter would require a hearing, which would require explaining why the letter needed to be sealed, which would effectively publicize its contents. The legal mechanisms designed to ensure transparency were now preventing the secrecy that Harrison wanted to maintain. "File it," Harrison said finally, "but file it under Mrs. Warfield's maiden name, Catherine Thornton. Place it in the section dealing with Charleston correspondence, not with the Warfield estate papers. Make it technically accessible, but practically invisible." Patterson understood the instruction. Hide the letter in plain sight. Buried in bureaucratic misfiling, where only someone specifically searching for Catherine's maiden name in connection with Charleston records would ever find it. The letter would be preserved, satisfying both legal requirements and Amelia's desire to maintain some record of truth, but it would be effectively invisible to casual researchers. The filing process, however, required that multiple clerks and court officials read the letter to determine proper categorization. Within 2 weeks, every person of standing in the county knew the truth. The secret was no longer secret, though it remained officially unacknowledged. People began looking at the prominent families differently, counting children, noting resemblances, reconstructing timelines. The social dynamics shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Invitations that had routinely gone to certain families were quietly withdrawn. Business partnerships dissolved without explanation. Political alliances fractured. The county was experiencing a slow-motion social earthquake, with families repositioning themselves relative to the scandal without ever explicitly acknowledging what they were doing. Joseph's position became untenable. He had remained at the Warfield plantation after Marcus's death, still employed, still living in his quarters behind the main house. But with the truth now circulating openly, even if unofficially, his presence was a constant reminder of the scandal. People stared at him in the streets of the county seat. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. The protection that Marcus had provided was gone, and Catherine was dead. He was exposed and vulnerable in ways he had never been, even during his years of legal enslavement. In October 1812, Marcus Jr. summoned Joseph to the house. The meeting was witnessed by 2 of Marcus Jr.'s brothers, apparently to ensure there would be corroboration of whatever was said. Marcus Jr. was direct. "You cannot remain here. Your presence makes the situation impossible for all of us. We will provide you with funds sufficient to establish yourself elsewhere, but you must leave Virginia." Joseph, who had spent nearly 40 years on the Warfield property and another 13 years as a freed man, unable to leave the county, finally spoke words that someone bothered to record. One of the brothers present wrote down the exchange in a letter to his sister. Joseph asked where he was supposed to go. Marcus said Philadelphia, where the free black community would accept him. Joseph asked if he had a choice. Marcus said no. Joseph asked if he would be able to return. Marcus said not in his lifetime. Joseph nodded and said, "I understand. I have always understood." Then he left the room. The funds were assembled in November. Thomas Bradford, Edmund Sutton, and 3 other family heads contributed to a collective payment. The total amount was recorded by Bradford in his personal accounts, $3,000, an enormous sum that represented both payment and silencing. It was hush money, though nothing in the legal documents described it as such. The payment was structured as charitable support for Joseph's relocation and establishment of new life circumstances, with no mention of why such charity was necessary or what it was intended to purchase. Joseph left Virginia in January 1813, traveling by coach to Richmond and then by ship to Philadelphia. 2. Several accounts from the period place him in Philadelphia's Southwark district, where a large community of free black people had established churches, mutual aid societies, and businesses. But Joseph left no paper trail beyond that. He appears in no city directories, no church records, no property deeds. If he lived in Philadelphia, he did so invisibly, perhaps deliberately erasing himself to avoid questions about his past. One intriguing possibility emerges from a Pennsylvania Abolition Society record dated 1000 817, which mentions a man named Joseph who had experience with the planter class of Virginia and was able to provide testimony about the intimate workings of plantation society. The man described in the record was approximately the right age and declined to give his surname, which was common among formerly enslaved people who rejected the names their enslavers had given them. The record notes that he was reluctant to speak of personal matters, but knowledgeable about the structures of power and secrecy that maintain the peculiar institution. Was this the same Joseph? The timeline fits, and the description, knowledgeable but reticent, experienced but unwilling to discuss personal history, matches what we know of Joseph's character and circumstances. But there is no definitive proof. The man in the Pennsylvania record disappears from the historical record after 1817, just as the Joseph of Virginia disappeared after 1813. Back in Virginia, the families attempted to reconstruct their social positions in the aftermath of the revelation. The strategy they employed was remarkable in its cynicism and its effectiveness. They maintained absolute public silence while privately acknowledging everything. No one denied the letter's contents. No one challenged the truth of Catherine's confession. But no one spoke of it openly either. The scandal existed in a strange liminal space, universally known, but never officially confirmed. The legal protections that had sustained the conspiracy during its active phase now protected it in its aftermath. To challenge the legitimacy of any of the 37 children would require proving adultery, which would require naming Joseph as the biological father, which would require public acknowledgement of the arrangement. But such acknowledgement would harm not just the families involved, but the entire structure of inheritance and legitimacy upon which Virginia's planter class depended. If it could happen to the Warfields, the Bradfords, the Suttons, families of unquestionable respectability, then how many other families might be hiding similar secrets? The planter class had a collective interest in maintaining the fiction of legitimacy, because to unravel one family's claims was to threaten everyone's claims. The conspiracy of silence evolved into something even more insidious, a conspiracy of mutual vulnerability, where everyone's complicity protected everyone else's position. The children, now adults with their own children and grandchildren, navigated this strange reality in different ways. Some chose exile, moving to frontier areas where their backgrounds were unknown. Marcus Jr. sold his portion of the Warfield estate in 1815 and moved to Kentucky, establishing himself as a horse breeder and never returning to Virginia. 2 of his brothers went to Tennessee. 3 of the Bradford offspring relocated to Georgia and Alabama, carrying their complicated inheritance to the expanding cotton South. Those who remained in Virginia developed a particular psychological adaptation. They maintained their social positions through a combination of defiance and careful positioning. They attended church, participated in civic life, and dared anyone to challenge their standing. And because challenging them would require public acknowledgement of the scandal, no one did. They existed in a state of permanent tension, socially secure, but psychologically haunted, legally legitimate, but personally aware of their fraudulent origins. The next generation, born after 1813, were raised in a strange environment of spoken and unspoken knowledge. Parents told them carefully edited versions of their family history, omitting crucial details while leaving gaps obvious enough that intelligent children could deduce the truth. Some families were more forthcoming than others, but all maintained the fundamental lie that the children were legitimate heirs of their legal fathers despite biological evidence to the contrary. Genetic inheritance, however, could not be controlled by legal documents or social conventions. As the children of the 37 grew into adulthood, certain physical characteristics became undeniable. The shape of the eyes, the structure of the face, the particular tone of skin that suggested mixed heritage, these appeared across family lines in patterns that could not be explained by the official genealogies. By the 1,832nd, careful observers might have noticed that members of supposedly unrelated families bore striking resemblances to one another, as if they shared a common ancestor, which of course they did. One particularly detailed observer was a portraitist named Samuel Ellis, who painted family pictures for Virginia's gentry throughout the 1,820 seconds and 1,830 seconds. His private notebooks discovered after his death contain observations that he never shared publicly. The Cavendish children bear remarkable resemblance to the Sutton children, particularly in the eyes and hands. The younger Bradford generation shows similarities to the Warfield cousins that suggest connection beyond marriage alliances. There is a consistent set of features appearing across multiple, supposedly separate lineages, most notably a particular structure of the jaw and a distinctive coloring that appears in no portraits of the legal fathers. Ellis was astute enough to recognize what he was seeing, but prudent enough never to mention it to his clients. His business depended on pleasing the planter class, not exposing their secrets. But his notebooks preserve observations that confirm the genetic legacy of the arrangement. Joseph's features passed down through 2 and then 3 generations, creating family resemblances that contradicted official genealogies. The Civil War, when it came, scattered the families further. Some fought for the Confederacy, defending a social order built on the very system that had classified their biological father as property. Others fled north, perhaps recognizing the profound irony of their position. At least 2 of Joseph's sons, legally white, socially accepted, biologically the children of a man who had been enslaved, owned enslaved people themselves. They participated in the system that would have enslaved their father, that had enslaved their father, that existed simultaneously in their past and their present. The psychological implications of this are staggering. How did they rationalize it? How did they look at the enslaved people they owned and not see their father's experience? The evidence suggests they did it the same way the broader planter class did, through carefully maintained cognitive dissonance, through appeals to law and custom, through the sustained fiction that legal categories reflected natural realities rather than social constructions. After the war, during Reconstruction, the social dynamic shifted again. The planter class lost much of its economic power, though it retained social prestige. The families connected to the scandal adapted as they had always adapted. They became merchants, lawyers, educators. They spread across the South and beyond, carrying their complicated genetics and even more complicated histories into new contexts where no one knew their origins. In 1873, a census taker in Richmond noted something unusual. Several families with different surnames listing children who appeared to be siblings based on age and features. The census taker mentioned this to his supervisor, who dismissed it as the census taker being unfamiliar with the complex marriage alliances of Virginia's old families. The observation was not pursued, and the census records show nothing irregular. But the moment illustrates how the secret persisted, visible to anyone who looked closely, yet invisible to official scrutiny, because no one with authority had incentive to investigate. The records themselves became the ultimate repository of truth. The county courthouse maintained everything. Catherine's letter filed under her maiden name in the Charleston correspondence section. The birth certificates of 37 children listing their legal fathers. Joseph's manumission papers. Marcus Warfield's will with its revealing bequest. The petition for Joseph to remain in Virginia, signed by multiple family heads. All of it preserved, cataloged after a fashion, technically accessible, but practically invisible. The courthouse survived fires in 1834 and 1867. Both times the records were rescued by clerks who understood their historical value, even if they didn't fully comprehend their contents. It survived a flood in 1842 when the Rappahannock overflowed its banks and water filled the first floor of the courthouse. The records were moved to the second floor, dried out and carefully preserved. It was as if some impulse toward historical truth persisted even in a society built on denial. In 1889, 77 years after Marcus Warfield's death, a historian named David Herschel was researching Virginia's planter families for a comprehensive genealogical study. He was working in the county archives when he found Catherine's letter misfiled under her maiden name. Herschel was a meticulous researcher trained at the University of Virginia, and he immediately recognized the significance of what he was reading. He spent the next 3 months cross-referencing the letter's claims with other county records. He examined birth certificates, marriage records, estate papers, property transactions, census data. What he discovered was a pattern so consistent it could not be coincidental. 7 women, all married to prominent planters, all producing children at consistent intervals over a 20-year period, all connected to the Warfield estate through documented visits and labor assistance arrangements. The children numbered 37 survivors out of 42 births, an infant survival rate of 88%, far higher than the typical rate for the planter class, which hovered around 65%. Herschel's conclusion was inescapable. The letter was true. The arrangement had existed. 37 children of Virginia's planter elite were biologically the offspring of a man who had been enslaved until 1800. These children had inherited property, enslaved people, social position, and political power, all based on legal fictions that everyone involved had agreed to maintain. Herschel wrote a comprehensive article documenting his findings. He was careful in his language, presenting it as a historical case study rather than a sensational expose. He focused on the legal and social mechanisms that had allowed such an arrangement to persist, using it as a lens to examine the contradictions of antebellum Virginia society. The article was 30 pages long, meticulously footnoted and devastating in its implications. He submitted the article to the Virginia Historical Society for publication in their quarterly journal. The article was accepted by the editorial board in November 1889. It was scheduled for publication in the January 1890 issue. Advanced copies were sent to the Society's major donors, as was customary. The response was immediate and severe. Within 2 weeks of the advanced copies being distributed, the Society received letters from 7 different families, descendants of the original conspirators, threatening to withdraw their financial support and to pursue legal action for defamation if the article were published. The families argued that Herschel's research was based on an unverified letter of dubious authenticity, that his conclusions were speculative, and that publication would unfairly damage the reputations of respected Virginia families based on insufficient evidence. The Society's board met in emergency session in December 1889. The meeting minutes preserved in the Society's archives reveal a heated debate. Some board members argued for publication on grounds of historical truth and scholarly integrity. Others argued that the Society had a responsibility to the families who supported it financially, and that publishing allegations of this magnitude without absolute proof would be irresponsible. The final vote was 8-5 against publication. The article was pulled from the January 1890 issue. Herschel was informed that further verification is needed before making such serious claims about respected Virginia families. He was encouraged in carefully worded language to pursue other research topics that might be more appropriate to the Society's mission of celebrating Virginia's heritage. Herschel was devastated but not surprised. He understood the forces array against publication. He made one more attempt, submitting a revised version of the article to a national historical journal based in Boston. This version was also rejected, though the reasons given were different. While the research is intriguing, the subject matter is too regional and too sensational for our journal's focus on broader historical trends. Herschel's notes and draft manuscript were archived with his other papers when he died in 1902. They remained there uncatalogued and unexamined for another 8 decades. The story he had uncovered remained buried, protected by the same mechanisms of silence that had protected it for a century. The families themselves continued to thrive and disperse. By 1900, descendants of the 37 children lived in Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, and Texas. Some had moved to northern cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, where their backgrounds were unknown and they could start fresh. A few had gone west to California and Oregon, as far from Virginia as they could get while remaining in the United States. They became lawyers, doctors, ministers, teachers, business owners, politicians. They joined country clubs, served on charitable boards, attended elite universities. Several became prominent in their communities, respected citizens whose genealogies appeared in local history books that traced their distinguished Virginia heritage back to the founding families of the colonies. The official genealogies listed their descent from men like Marcus Warfield, Thomas Bradford, and Edmund Sutton. The truth that they descended from a man whose legal name had been reduced to Joseph and whose status had been property was known to some family members but never acknowledged publicly. Joseph himself left one more trace in the historical record, though its authenticity cannot be conclusively verified. In 1835, a black church in Philadelphia buried a man identified only as Joseph, formerly of Virginia, aged approximately 80 years. The church records note that he lived quietly among us for many years, worked as a carpenter, and kept his own counsel regarding his past. Several members of the congregation attended his funeral, but he left no known family, no property, and no detailed account of his life. If this was the same Joseph, and the age, location, and description of being formerly of Virginia suggest it might have been, then he lived the final 22 years of his life in obscurity, working with his hands, maintaining the silence that had been imposed on him for 4 decades. He died anonymous, buried in a cemetery whose precise location is no longer known, leaving behind only the genetic legacy he had no choice in creating and the conspiracy he had been forced to participate in. The ultimate irony is that the family's attempts to hide the truth ensured its preservation. If they had simply destroyed the records, burned Catherine's letter, eliminated the paper trail, the story would have disappeared completely. But their solution, misfiling, archiving, maintaining technical accessibility while ensuring practical invisibility, meant that everything was preserved. The truth was there, waiting for anyone who knew where to look and had the courage to speak it. Today, descendants of those 37 children live throughout the United States. Most have no idea that their genealogy includes this chapter. The official family trees in genealogical databases and historical societies list descent from the planter families, with no mention of biological paternity that contradicted legal documentation. The secret has been so successfully maintained that it has become invisible even to those who carry Joseph's genetics in their blood. The records remain in the county courthouse archive, technically public, practically forgotten. Catherine's letter is still there, filed under Thornton, in the Charleston correspondence section, exactly where Judge Harrison ordered it to be placed in 1812. Joseph's manumission papers are there. The birth certificates are there. Marcus Warfield's will is still there, tucked into an archival box, preserved in acid-free folders, waiting for someone patient enough to assemble the scattered pieces into a story that was never meant to be told. And what does that story show us? It shows just how elastic a supposedly rigid social order can become when those at the top need it to bend. It reveals how contradictions can survive for generations when every powerful person involved shares an interest in maintaining the illusion. It proves that the categories people treat as fixed race, legitimacy, inheritance, belonging, are constructs that can be rearranged whenever authority and self-interest demand it. And it suggests something deeper, that American history holds far more of these hidden arrangements than we care to admit. They lie buried in mislabeled boxes, in county archives, in files known only to insiders who never speak publicly about them. The families created by this particular arrangement went on to shape the South and, indirectly, the entire nation. They held office, built businesses, influenced culture, and lived as white Americans of honored pedigree. Their story is both unique. Few arrangements match this one in scale or longevity, and completely representative of the countless ways people in the antebellum South negotiated race, power, and legitimacy in the blurry space between law and lived reality. And then there is Joseph, the quiet center of the whole system and the most unknowable figure in the narrative. We can document what was demanded of him, what was taken from him, and what small concessions he may have received, but we cannot know how he made sense of his role. Was he a victim? Absolutely, he held no legal right to refuse. Was he a collaborator? His ongoing participation sustained the arrangement. Or was he something more complicated, a man navigating an impossible world with the limited agency available to him? The record answers none of this. It offers only the steady, deliberate silence Joseph kept until the end of his life. So what do you make of this? Do you think these kinds of hidden arrangements were more common in the antebellum South than the official histories suggest? How do you understand Joseph's position as victim, participant, or something that doesn't fit any simple category? And what does it mean that the descendants of this arrangement are still here today, walking among us with histories and lineages they may never learn? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this journey into the buried corners of American history spoke to you, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and pass this video along to someone who's willing to confront the uncomfortable truths that archives refuse to forget. More stories like this are waiting in courthouses and historical societies all across the South. We'll keep bringing them to light.